I never anticipated a single evening could alter everything, but that's precisely what occurred when I found myself alone with my father-in-law, Henry. It was meant to be an ordinary night, but life occasionally throws unpredictable curveballs, moments that make you question everything you thought you knew. I was merely his son-in-law, married to his daughter Lisa, living a predictable life. Yet there was an unspoken tension between us, intensifying with each glance, each exchanged word. What followed was unimaginable, yet unstoppable. It all began when I married Lisa. We'd been together for a few years before the wedding, and I'd met her family numerous times. Her father, Henry, always possessed a kind, respectful, yet somewhat intimidating demeanor. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a quiet authority that commanded attention. He was the type who didn't need to speak much. His silence spoke volumes. Initially, I didn't pay him much attention. He was my father-in-law, Lisa's dad, polite, courteous, always inquiring about work or life during family dinners. Nothing unusual. But one evening, things shifted unexpectedly. Lisa was away on a business trip, leaving me at her family's home for a few days. Her mother was visiting her sister, so it was just Mr. K.H. and me under one roof. The situation felt awkward. I wasn't accustomed to his sole company, and the silence between us stretched for hours. We managed small talk about work, sports, and the weather, typical topics. Then, one evening, everything changed. After dinner, I was in the living room, channel surfing, when Henry entered with a glass of whiskey. He sat opposite me, his usually calm eyes holding an unfamiliar intensity. We conversed briefly, but the tension was palpable. I felt his gaze linger, and for inexplicable reasons, my heart raced. "You seem quiet tonight," he remarked, his deep voice breaking the silence. I shrugged, uncertain how to respond. "Just thinking about work, I guess." He nodded but didn't avert his gaze, his sharp eyes studying me, making me feel strangely vulnerable. "You know," he began, swirling his whiskey, "I've always admired your composure. You're responsible. Lisa is fortunate to have you." I smiled awkwardly, unsure of his intent. "Thank you, I try." He leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "But there's more to you, isn't there? More than you reveal." The statement hung in the air, heavy with meaning I couldn't decipher. My throat tightened, and I looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm not sure what you mean," I mumbled, my voice betraying my unease. He paused before responding, taking a long sip of his whiskey, his eyes still fixed on me. "You're a good man," he stated, his voice softening, "but sometimes even good men harbor desires they don't discuss." His words sent a shiver down my spine, my pulse quickening. There was something in his gaze, in the implication behind his words, that suggested more than casual conversation. I attempted to dismiss it with a laugh. "We all have things we don't talk about, I suppose." He chuckled, a low rumble. True enough. Silence descended again, heavy and uncomfortable. I shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of his stare. An undeniable tension, something unspoken and unacknowledged, had arisen between us. Later that night, in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably shifted. I replayed the conversation repeatedly, wondering if I'd imagined the intensity in his eyes, the deeper meaning in his words. But the more I pondered it, the more certain I became that it was real. The next day, normalcy returned, at least superficially. We had breakfast, exchanged pleasantries, and went about our day as if nothing had transpired. Yet, beneath the surface, the unspoken connection, the altered tension, lingered. It wasn't until evening, as we sat in the living room again, that the atmosphere thickened with that same unsettling tension. He sat closer this time, close enough that I could detect the faint scent of his cologne mingled with whiskey. He spoke little, but his presence felt heavier. Then, just as I thought the night would pass in silence, he leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "You're thinking about last night, aren't you?" I froze, my breath hitching. How did he know? How could he sense that his words had haunted me all day? I attempted to feign indifference. I don't know what you're talking about, I stammered, my heart pounding. But he wasn't convinced. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that instant, I knew there was no escaping the truth. Something had shifted between us, something undeniable. And the strangest part? I wasn't sure I wanted to escape it. But that wasn't the end. There was so much more I hadn't even begun to comprehend. The following days passed in a blur. I tried convincing myself I'd overanalyzed the situation, that what transpired between Henry and me was merely a fleeting anomaly. But his words, his gaze, the way he'd leaned in, as if on the verge of saying or doing something more, it all replayed endlessly in my mind. Lisa remained away on her trip, and I found myself spending more time alone with Henry than I felt comfortable with. I tried to avoid prolonged proximity, but we inevitably ended up together. At the dinner table, in the living room, the palpable tension always present, like a gathering storm. One evening, after another lengthy, silent dinner, Henry suggested we watch a movie. I hesitated, but didn't want to seem rude. Besides, it would provide a distraction from the awkwardness. We sat at opposite ends of the couch, the TV flickering in the dim room. I tried to concentrate on the film, but couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. Each time I glanced over, he was watching me, his expression inscrutable. My heart raced, my palms sweat, and I shifted uneasily. Halfway through the movie, the tension became unbearable, suffocating me with its intensity. I needed to break the silence. "I think I'll head to bed," I mumbled, rising abruptly. But before I could escape, he reached out, his firm but gentle grip stopping me. A jolt of fear, excitement, and confusion surged through me. "Wait," he said softly, his voice low and almost pleading. "We need to talk." I froze, my mind reeling. I didn't want this conversation, didn't want to acknowledge what was happening. But his eyes told me there was no avoiding it any longer. Reluctantly, I sat back down, my heart pounding as I braced myself. He didn't release my arm immediately, his touch lingering a moment too long before he let go. "You've been avoiding me," he stated, his voice calm but laced with something darker. I swallowed, attempting to deflect. "I've just been busy with work." He shook his head slowly, a humorless smile playing on his lips. "Don't lie. We both know something has changed." There it was, the undeniable truth laid bare. My heart raced, my throat tightened, and panic washed over me. I didn't know how to respond, how to process the turmoil within me. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice trembling with uncertainty. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You do know. You felt it, just like I did." I couldn't breathe. The room felt constricting. I wanted to flee, to run as far away from this conversation as possible. But something held me captive, unable to move, unable to look away from him. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out again, his fingers lightly brushing the back of my hand. The simple touch sent a shockwave through me, igniting something deep within that I hadn't been prepared for. "I've seen the way you look at me," he said softly, his eyes piercing mine. "The way you avoid me. The way you tense up whenever I'm near. You're afraid of this, but you don't have to be." I pulled my hand away, the sudden loss of contact both relieving and strangely unsettling. My mind spun, my emotions a tangled mess of confusion, fear, and something else I didn't want to admit. "This is wrong," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "You're my father-in-law. I'm married to your daughter." He nodded slowly, as if anticipating my response. "I know. But that doesn't change what's happening between us. You can't deny it." I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was mistaken, that it was all a misunderstanding, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, I knew he was right. There was something between us, something frightening, something I desperately wanted to ignore but couldn't. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice trembling as the weight of the situation crashed down. He leaned closer, his eyes softening slightly. "You don't have to do anything right now. Just allow yourself to feel it. Don't run from it." The tension between us was almost unbearable, thick enough to choke the air from my lungs. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to flee, to leave the room, the house, this entire situation spiraling out of control. But I was paralyzed, caught between the urge to escape and an inexplicable pull toward him. "I can't," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't right." He didn't argue, didn't push. Instead, he simply looked at me with those deep, penetrating eyes, his gaze filled with an unnamed emotion. In that moment, I realized he wasn't just my father-in-law anymore. He was something more, dangerous, forbidden, something I shouldn't want. But I did. The realization hit me hard, leaving me breathless and reeling. I desired him, despite the inherent wrongness, despite the betrayal, and I hated myself for it. Before I could speak, he stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked toward the door. He paused, turning back for one last look, his expression unreadable. "When you're ready to talk, I'll be here," he said quietly, then left, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the overwhelming emotions I'd been trying to suppress. I exhaled shakily, my heart still racing. What had just happened? How had things escalated so quickly? My mind spun, torn between fear and an undeniable attraction to him. This was far from over. We both knew it. There was no escaping the truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to fight it anymore. The storm had only just begun, and I was already in too deep. The days blurred together since that conversation. The weight of unspoken words between Mr. Khan and me hung heavy in the air, permeating every room. Lisa was still away, and the more time I spent with him, the harder it became to ignore the simmering tension between us. There were moments when I'd catch his lingering gaze, as if waiting for me to acknowledge the unspoken. But I never did. I couldn't. I didn't trust myself to handle it. The rational part of me insisted it was a fleeting infatuation, that this strange attraction would vanish upon Lisa's return. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Something fundamental had shifted. That evening, the tension was particularly acute. I was in the kitchen, mindlessly stirring pasta, trying to distract myself. The sound of approaching footsteps made my heart jump. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. His presence was palpable, electrifying the air. "You're cooking," Henry observed, his low voice sending shivers down my spine. He stood close behind me, close enough to feel his body heat. I nodded, concentrating on the pasta, my mind racing. I thought I'd make something simple. Lisa should be back tomorrow. Mentioning her name felt like a splash of cold water, a stark reminder of reality, of the boundaries we were dangerously close to crossing. But even her name couldn't extinguish the pull I felt toward him. Henry didn't respond to the mention of his daughter. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence filling the small kitchen. "You've been quiet lately," he noted, his tone gentle but probing. I swallowed hard, tightening my grip on the wooden spoon. "I've had a lot on my mind," I mumbled. "You're not the only one." His words sent a jolt through me. There it was again, the unspoken tension, the pull neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. My heart pounded as I turned off the stove, suddenly feeling breathless. "I don't think—" I began, but he cut me off. He moved closer, so close I could feel his breath on my neck. My pulse quickened, and I froze, unable to move or think. I knew what was coming. I could feel it in the air, in his overwhelming presence. Then he said it, the words I'd been desperately trying to avoid. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening," he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. I turned slowly, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to run. But when I met his eyes, all those thoughts vanished. There was something in his gaze. My gaze fell upon something raw and exposed, something I'd never witnessed before. It felt like staring into a mirror, reflecting my own suppressed confusion and longing. I wanted to speak, to tell him this was wrong, that we had to stop, but the words caught in my throat. Before I could think, before I could even process what I was doing, I leaned in. It was a hesitant movement, a test, hoping he'd pull away, stop me. But he remained motionless, his breath shallow, his eyes locked on mine. And then, our lips touched. The kiss was soft, barely there, the lightest brush of lips, as if we both feared the implications. Yet that fleeting contact sent a shockwave through me, igniting a hidden fire within. I recoiled instantly, heart pounding, mind racing. What had I done? I looked up, expecting anger, disappointment, something to jolt me back to reality. But his gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. We stood frozen, the weight of the moment suffocating us. My mind screamed for me to break the silence, but before I could, he leaned in again. This time, there was no hesitation. His lips pressed against mine with certainty, purpose. For a moment, everything else vanished. The kitchen, the house, the world outside. All that existed was the kiss, this undeniable thing between us. I kissed him back. It wasn't planned, it wasn't rational, but in that moment, it felt right. My mind yelled at me to stop, to remember he was my father-in-law, that this was a line we should never cross. But the pull was too strong, the desire overwhelming. After an eternity, he pulled away, his breathing heavy, his eyes searching mine. He was looking for understanding, perhaps reassurance, but I had no answers. My heart raced, my mind spun. "We need to stop," I whispered, barely audible. "This isn't right." "I know," he replied, his voice thick with emotion, "but it's too late to stop now." He was right. The kiss had altered everything, pushing us past the point of no return. I stepped back, creating space between us. "Lisa will be back tomorrow," I said, more to myself than him. "We can't—" He just looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't decipher, something that terrified me. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly. And I wasn't sure if it was meant to comfort or worsen things. I nodded, unconvinced. How could we fix this, erase the kiss, and pretend everything was normal? We couldn't. I turned away, unable to meet his gaze any longer, and left the kitchen, my heart pounding, my mind in turmoil. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, the house was unsettlingly quiet. Every sound, the creaking floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, seemed amplified, as if the walls themselves held the secrets of the previous night. I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cold cup of coffee. My thoughts tangled, my emotions raw. Sleep had been impossible. The kiss with Mr. K.H. replayed endlessly in my mind. Today, Lisa was coming home. I told myself that her return would restore normalcy, that Mr. K.H. and I would bury what happened. But deep down, I knew the kiss had irrevocably changed things. Footsteps broke the silence, and my body tensed. I knew it was him. Every fiber of my being was hyper-aware of his presence. "Morning." Mr. K.H.'s voice was low, hesitant. I didn't look up. "Morning," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. He poured himself coffee. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. "Lisa's flight gets in around noon," I said, breaking the tension. The silence was oppressive, demanding to be broken. "We need to talk about last night," I said, my voice strained. He sat across from me, his gaze intense, studying me carefully. His voice was even, but I sensed the tension beneath. I finally met his eyes, my chest tightening under his scrutiny. I felt lost, unsure how to even begin addressing the mess we'd created. "What's there to talk about?" I mumbled, my voice barely a whisper. "You know what?" he replied, his tone firm but gentle. "We can't just ignore it." "I know that," I retorted, frustration rising. But what do you expect me to say? That everything's fine? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not asking for that. But we need to decide what to do next. Panic welled up inside me. There's nowhere to go from here, I said, my voice trembling. It was a mistake. We need to forget about it. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightening slightly. You think you can just forget about it? After everything? Anger and confusion surged through me. What else can we do? Lisa's coming back. She can't find out. It would destroy everything. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. You're right. She can't know. But that doesn't change what happened. And it doesn't change how we feel. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. He was right. The attraction between us was undeniable, and it terrified me. As I said earlier, we need to move past this, I said finally, my voice barely audible. For everyone's sake. He was silent for a moment, his piercing eyes seeming to see right through me. Finally he nodded, but his expression was resigned. I understand, he said softly. But that doesn't mean it'll be easy. I didn't respond. There were no easy answers, no way to cleanly untangle this mess. I could only hope that Lisa's return would create enough distance between us to let this, whatever this was, fade away. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. Lisa's flight arrived on time, and by early afternoon, she was home, smiling and laughing as if nothing had changed. I tried to mirror her energy, to pretend everything was normal, but I felt suffocated. Henry was unusually quiet, keeping his distance but never straying too far. Every time our eyes met, the tension between us was palpable. That evening, Lisa suggested dinner together, a celebration of her return. I agreed, but the thought of sitting at the table with both her and Henry was agonizing. Throughout the meal, I could barely concentrate, my mind replaying the events of the past few days. The kiss, the tension, the unspoken words. Then, it happened. A small, subtle moment, but enough. Reaching for the wine, my hand brushed against Henry's. The briefest contact sent a jolt of electricity through me. Our eyes met for a split second, and I saw everything in his gaze. Longing, conflict, forbidden desire. In that moment, I knew this wasn't over. After dinner, Lisa excused herself for a work call, leaving Henry and me alone in the dining room. The silence was deafening. It's not fair to her, I said, my voice strained. He nodded, his expression unreadable. I know. I'm serious, I continued, my frustration overflowing. I can't keep living like this, with this tension. It's going to tear everything apart. I understand, he said quietly, his gaze steady. But it's not something we can just turn off. He stared at me, searching my eyes for a solution, for reassurance. But I had none. I was at my breaking point. He stood up slowly, deliberately. If that's what you want, he said softly, his eyes betraying the emotion he was trying to hide. It's not about what I want, I replied, my voice shaking. It's about what's right. I love Lisa. I can't betray her like this. He nodded, tension evident in his posture. I know you're right. A long silence stretched between us, an eternity. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room. I sank back into my chair, my head in my hands, trying to catch my breath, to make sense of it all. But there was no sense to be made. I was trapped between my love for Lisa and the impossible connection with Henry. The reality was stark. This wouldn't just disappear. It would linger, a shadow following me everywhere. No matter how much I wanted to forget, to move on, a part of me would always be tied to that night, to that moment, and to the man who had changed everything.